Welcome, dear viewers, to a journey back through time into the very heart of one of the most dramatic and defining moments of the First Crusade, the Siege of Antioch. As you watch this film, you are not simply an observer of history. You are stepping into the dust, the hunger, the hope, and the desperate courage of men and women who stood at the crossroads of faith and survival. This is not just the story of a city under siege. It is the story of empires clashing, of rival generals plotting, of warriors enduring months of famine, disease, and betrayal, and of faith tested to its very breaking point. You will meet noble knights and cunning princes, emperors and sultans, soldiers and civilians, all bound together in one of the most astonishing struggles of the Middle Ages. Stay with us, for this journey will reveal how the fate of Antioch would echo far beyond its walls, reshaping the Crusades and the history of East and West forever. Prepare yourself for a tale of sacrifice, ambition, faith, and fire. This is the Siege of Antioch. Imagine standing before massive stone walls that tower over you. Walls so high and thick they seem to scrape the heavens themselves. Behind those walls, tens of thousands wait, armed and ready. Outside, a vast army, starving, exhausted yet unbroken, surrounds the fortress. The winter winds cut like blades. Disease spreads like wildfire, and food is nothing but a memory. This is not a battle of days. This is a siege of 8 long, brutal months. Allies betray, enemies surround, and hope fades. And yet, through despair, visions of saints, and the iron will of commanders, a miracle will be claimed, and history itself will be changed. This is not just war, this is survival, this is destiny. This is the Siege of Antioch. Subscribe for more history. Like and comment if you believe history should never be forgotten, and share to spark conversation about the lessons we must learn from the past. This is not myth, this is history. And it begins here, acclaimed in the year Itenling Josewu. The world of medieval Christendom trembled with unrest. To the east, the Byzantine Empire struggled under pressure from the Seljuk Turks. To the west, peasants groaned beneath hunger and feudal strife. Yet amid this turmoil, a spark was struck, one that would blaze into a storm of steel and fire across continents. That spark was lit at the Council of Clermont, when Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd of clergy, knights, and common folk, and spoke words that would shake the world. Urban's voice carried across the square like a bell of destiny. In French, he declared that Christ's holy places were in the hands of the infidel, that pilgrims suffered unspeakable outrages, and that God's faithful were called to take up arms. He promised not only forgiveness of sins, but eternal glory for those who marched east to reclaim the Holy Land. The response was thunderous. Men shouted Deus Vult, God wills it, a cry that would echo across battlefields for generations. Some were driven by faith, others by ambition, and many by desperation. Lords saw opportunity to carve new realms. Peasants saw escape from endless toil. The devout saw salvation. It was not a single army that formed, but many. Princes and knights began mustering men under their banners. Bohemond of Taranto, the cunning Norman, Raymond of Toulouse, the fiery Provençal count, Godfrey of Bouillon, the pious Duke of Lorraine, and far to the east, Emperor Alexios I, Komnenos of Byzantium, watched cautiously, wary of allies, who might just as easily become conquerors. But for now, the mood was triumphant. From the smallest villages to the greatest courts, thousands swore oaths and stitched crosses onto their cloaks. Families wept as fathers and sons left for a land they had never seen and might never return from. The road to Antioch and beyond had begun. What started as a sermon would unleash one of the longest and bloodiest sieges in medieval history. The Crusade had been called, and history would never be the same. The winter of Seljuk gave way to a spring unlike any Christendom had ever seen. From the forests of France to the plains of Germany, from the coasts of Italy to the hills of Flanders, roads swelled with movement. Banners bearing the cross fluttered in the wind, and the thunder of hooves mingled with the chants of priests. The Crusade, called by the voice of Pope Urban II, was now a living river of humanity flowing eastward. The march was no single column but a patchwork of armies. Each lord led his own host, drawn from vassals, mercenaries, and hopeful peasants. The mightiest among them was Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lorraine, a tall, pious knight whose reputation for courage made him a natural leader. Alongside him marched his brother Baldwin, ambitious and calculating. Further south, the Normans of Italy, led by Bohemond of Taranto and his fiery nephew Tancred, prepared to carve their destinies. In the east, Bohemon's cunning mind burned with ambition, not only for holy victory, but for land and power. Raymond of Toulouse, older and unyielding, rallied a massive Provençal army, declaring himself a servant of God yet dreaming of glory. The journey was treacherous from the first step. Supplies ran thin, and untrained peasants often slowed the knight's advance. Many among the people's crusade, simple folk who had rushed ahead without order, perished to hunger, ambushes, and their own reckless zeal. Their fate was a grim warning of what awaited those who underestimated the road ahead. In Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I, Komnenos watched this spectacle with wary eyes. The arrival of these vast armies was both a promise and a threat. He needed their strength against the Seljuks, but he feared their greed. One by one, the Crusader leaders met him, swearing oaths of fealty, some sincere, others hollow. Alexios supplied them with guides and ships, but never let go of his suspicion. As the armies pressed on, tensions grew. Language, pride, and ambition divided the Crusader lords. Yet the vision of Jerusalem burned in their hearts, binding them together in fragile unity. Across the Anatolian plains, men trudged through blistering sun and biting cold. They fought raiders, endured thirst, and buried comrades by the roadside. And yet, despite all, they marched on. Every mile brought them closer to Antioch, the mighty gate to Syria. A city that would test their faith, break their bodies, and forge their legend. But for now, the march eastward was filled with hope, the air alive with the cry that had begun it all. Deus Vult, the march eastward was not a glorious parade, but a crucible. From the rolling fields of Hungary to the scorched plains of Anatolia, the Crusaders faced endless trials that would test their faith, their strength, and their resolve. At first, the roads were lined with curious onlookers, villagers watching in awe as knights and peasants streamed past, their cloaks stitched with crosses. Some towns welcomed the Crusaders, selling them food and water. Others locked their gates, fearing the hungry tide that consumed everything in its path. Soon, the weight of the journey began to grind down even the strongest. In the Balkans, tempers flared. Hungry peasants raided farms, and skirmishes broke out with local soldiers. Emperor Alexios's guides tried to maintain order, but suspicion brewed. Many Crusaders whispered that the Byzantines were not allies but manipulators, leading them into danger for their own gain. Crossing into Anatolia, the true suffering began. The sun scorched the men by day, and the cold pierced their bones by night. Horses collapsed on the rocky paths, their carcasses left behind to rot. Food grew scarce. Soldiers boiled leather for broth, while peasants foraged roots and grass. Disease spread in the camps, taking the weak and the young. Graves multiplied along the roadside, each marked with a crude wooden cross. It was here that discipline mattered most. Godfrey of Bouillon kept his men in tight formation, punishing looters and keeping morale steady through prayer. Bohemon's Normans moved like wolves, raiding small towns for supplies with brutal efficiency. Raymond of Toulouse, ever stubborn, urged his followers to endure the march as a holy penance, though even his words could not silence their groans of hunger. Not all trials came from nature. Bands of Turkish raiders shadowed the columns, striking suddenly at stragglers. Peasant families walking at the rear were easy prey, and knights had to ride back constantly to defend them. Tancred, young and fearless, earned admiration by leading swift counterattacks, his sword flashing in the sun as he scattered horsemen into the dust. Yet, even amidst hardship, faith held the army together. Priests carried relics, raising them high during prayers that rang out over barren plains. Some swore they saw visions, crosses of fire in the sky, or saints walking among the weary. Hope was a fragile thing, but it endured. The road of trials forged the Crusaders into something harder than steel. For every knight who fell, another swore to carry the cross to Jerusalem. For every peasant who perished, others pressed on, clinging to the promise of salvation. And as they trudged ever eastward, they began to whisper of the great city ahead, Antioch, the mighty fortress on the Orontes River, a city that stood like a wall between them and the Holy Land. A city that would either break them or make them immortal. In the autumn of Echenling Josati, after endless trials across the Anatolian wilderness, the Crusaders finally beheld Antioch. Rising before them on the banks of the Orontes River stood a fortress like no other. Massive stone walls stretching nearly 5 kilometers, studded with towers and gates, girded by mountains to the south and a river to the north. For centuries, Antioch had been the jewel of Syria, a city of wealth, learning, and faith, coveted by emperors and sultans alike. Now it loomed as an immovable obstacle. The Crusaders stood in awe, weary yet defiant. For many, the sight was both terrifying and exhilarating. To capture Antioch meant opening the road to Jerusalem. To fail meant death or disgrace. Bohemond of Taranto, ever calculating, studied the defenses with sharp eyes. He knew this was no city to be taken by storm. It would require cunning, patience, and perhaps betrayal. Raymond of Toulouse, however, bristled with zeal, declaring the walls no match for the will of God. Inside the city, the Turkish governor Yagi Siyan prepared for the storm. A seasoned commander, he expelled the city's Christians, fearing they would aid the enemy, and fortified the gates. His son Shams ad-Dawla rallied the garrison, swearing Antioch would never fall. The Crusaders built camps around the city, cutting it off from supplies. But Antioch was vast, and their numbers too few to encircle it fully. The siege began not with glory, but with watchful waiting. Archers exchanged arrows across the trenches, and the sound of horns echoed from the walls. The city stood defiant, and the Crusaders knew they faced not days, but months of struggle. Antioch had become the prize, and every man, knight, peasant, or prince, felt the weight of destiny pressing down. The Crusaders soon discovered why Antioch was called impregnable. Its walls, soaring as high as a cathedral spire, stretched in a near unbroken chain of towers and gates. Over 400 watchtowers crowned the fortress, each manned with archers and defenders, ready to rain death from above. The southern wall clung to the crags of Mount Silpius, while the northern side plunged toward the Orontes. No siege engines the Crusaders possessed could match such strength. Bohemond and the other leaders gathered for counsel. Some urged a direct assault, but the attempt would be suicidal. Instead, they resolved to strangle the city, cut off its supplies, starve its people, and wait for a chance. Yet this was easier said than done. The Crusader army was too small to surround Antioch completely. Food and men slipped through, keeping Yagisitian supplied. Life in camp grew tense. Peasants scraped at the earth for roots, knights shared stale bread, and horses wasted away. From the walls, defenders jeered, tossing down animal carcasses to taunt their starving besiegers. Still, the Crusaders persevered, erecting wooden towers and digging ditches to block the gates. Antioch's shadow stretched over them, a reminder that faith alone would not bring victory. Strategy, betrayal, or miracle, only such things could bring the giant to its knees. Frustration soon boiled into violence. In late Sortie, eager knights launched probing assaults against Antioch's walls. With ladders and ropes, small bands of Crusaders stormed forward, their shouts echoing against stone. Arrows rained down, stones crashed, and boiling oil poured from above. The assaults ended in disaster. Dozens were cut down before they could even reach the battlements. Bohemond pulled his men back, fuming at the waste. Raymond seethed, convinced the enemy mocked their courage. Tancred, ever daring, led a sortie near the bridge gate, but he too was driven off. Each attempt proved the walls unyielding. Meanwhile, Yagisian's defenders grew emboldened. They launched sudden sallies, striking at Crusader camps before retreating. The besiegers were forced to remain constantly alert, swords in hand day and night. Still, not all was failure. Crusaders seized nearby villages and strongpoints, tightening their grip on the valley. Slowly, they carved footholds. Though Antioch itself remained untouchable, the first blood had been spilled, and though the Crusaders licked their wounds, they swore that no wall, no tower, no garrison could outlast their faith. Yet hunger already gnawed at their resolve. Foreshadowing greater trials to come, winter closed its grip on the valley. Supplies dwindled, and the Crusaders soon faced their cruelest foe, hunger. Fields were stripped bare, villages emptied. Men gnawed leather straps and roots. Some whispered of cannibalism. Horses, once the pride of knights, were slaughtered for meat, their bones boiled for broth. Starvation drove many to desperation. Desertions increased as knights abandoned their vows and fled into the night. Bohemond and Raymond cracked down harshly, executing deserters to set an example. Priests urged the people to see their suffering as holy penance, promising eternal reward for endurance. Inside Antioch, life was harsh but bearable. Supplies still reached the city through secret routes. Yagisitian mocked the Crusaders, certain they would crumble before the spring. Yet even in despair, sparks of hope remained. A sudden foraging expedition struck deep into enemy lands and returned with herds of sheep, reviving the starving camp. Bohemond's cunning in organizing raids kept his men alive. Faith, hunger, and steel were locked in endless struggle. The siege was no longer just a test of arms. It had become a war against time, against the body itself. Antioch stood firm, while the Crusaders withered by early Seljuk. The Crusaders had endured months of misery. Winter storms swept the valley, flooding trenches and collapsing tents. Men froze in their armor, their breath rising in clouds as they shivered around. Dying fires. Sickness spread like wildfire. Dysentery, fever, and plague carried off thousands. The dead piled high, unburied, their stench choking the living. Yet the army clung to its faith. Bishops led solemn processions around the camp, carrying relics and chanting prayers. Some knights claimed visions of saints who promised salvation if they held fast. Others despaired, cursing their leaders for dragging them into this death trap. Still, glimmers of hope pierced the gloom. A fleet of Genoese ships arrived at the coast. bringing supplies that revived the starving host. Small victories against raided leaders like Tancred and Godfrey rode tirelessly through the camp, sharing the burdens of the lowest soldiers, reminding them of Jerusalem still ahead. Inside Antioch, Yagi Siyan watched with grim satisfaction, yet he too grew wary. For though the Crusaders starved, they did not break. Their faith was a weapon as sharp as any sword. The winter of misery did not destroy them. It hardened them into iron, preparing them for the trials yet to come. Even as hunger gnawed at the Crusaders, the politics of alliance threatened to unravel their cause. The presence of the Byzantine Empire cast a long shadow. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, though far away in Constantinople, had demanded oaths from the Crusader leaders. Antioch and other captured cities were to be restored to him. But as the months wore on, distrust poisoned the oath. Bohemond of Taranto, more ambitious than pious, began whispering that Alexios could not be trusted. He argued that if the emperor did not return to aid them, Antioch should belong to the Crusaders themselves. Raymond of Toulouse, however, clung to the honor of the pledge, declaring their mission holy, not political. The rift deepened. Messengers carried pleas to Byzantium for reinforcements, but no help came. Supplies trickled slowly, leaving the army restless and divided. Around the campfires, arguments flared between Norman and Provençal, German and Italian. Unity frayed. Meanwhile, Yagi Siyan sought to exploit these divisions, sending envoys to spread false rumors and bribe deserters. Some Crusaders began to question whether this was truly God's will or merely the ambition of lords. In Antioch's shadow, the crusade was no longer just a war against walls. It was a war of wills, of rivalries and broken trust. As the winter dragged on, despair grew too heavy for some. In the dead of night, knights quietly gathered their retinues and fled. Among them was Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthiest nobles of France. Terrified by starvation and convinced the siege was doomed, he abandoned his comrades and rode west, spreading tales of hopeless ruin. His desertion struck like a knife. Crusaders awoke to find their numbers thinned. Their leaders vanished. Bohemond thundered in anger, declaring deserters worse than Turks. Raymond wept with rage, calling them cowards before God. Yet the wound was deeper than pride. Desertion shook morale, breeding whispers of doom. If great lords could abandon the cause, what hope had the common soldier? Priests urged the faithful to hold fast, warning that betrayal invited damnation. In Antioch, Yagi Siyan celebrated. Con offered and his enemy was unraveling. He paraded prisoners through the streets, declaring the Franks broken, but not all fled. For every deserter there were those who swore to endure or die. These men and women clung tighter to their cause, hardening their resolve. The desertion had weakened the crusade, but it also forced those who remained to steel themselves for the trials to come. In the face of despair, one leader's voice rose louder than all, Raymond of Toulouse. Though age and illness weighed upon him, he burned with zeal, his faith unshaken. Standing before his starving men, he declared their suffering holy, their endurance proof of God's will. He promised that glory and paradise awaited those who did not falter. Raymond's speeches inspired many, but his stubborn pride alienated others. He refused compromise with Bohemond, refused retreat, and demanded obedience. His Provençal army followed him with near-fanatical devotion, singing hymns even as their bellies ached with hunger. To prove his resolve, Raymond personally joined laborers in building fortifications, lifting stones, and wielding tools beside peasants. His firebrand spirit shamed deserters and rekindled faith among the weary. Yet his inflexibility also deepened divisions with Bohemond, whose cunning clashed with Raymond's righteous obstinacy. Still, for the common Crusader, Raymond's example was a light in the darkness. He embodied the unbreakable spirit of those who believed this was not merely a war for land, but for heaven itself. The siege endured not by strategy alone, but by the fire that leaders like Raymond kindled in the hearts of the desperate. While Raymond preached faith, Bohemond plotted ambition. The Norman prince was no mere pilgrim. He saw in Antioch the chance to carve a principality for himself. Watching the walls day after day, he sought cracks in the city's defenses. Not of stone, but of loyalty. Bohemond courted spies, sending envoys to discontented guards within Antioch. He promised gold, land, and favor to any who would betray their masters. His boldness unsettled some Crusaders, who accused him of seeking power for himself. But Bohemond silenced critics with results. His raids fed his men, his discipline kept their ranks strong, and his confidence inspired hope. He played a long game. If Antioch fell, he vowed, it would be by his hand. He began quietly rallying supporters among the other lords, offering promises of spoils. In secret, a name was whispered, Firouz, an Armenian guard within Antioch's garrison, embittered and open to treachery. Though the deal was not yet struck, Bohemond's ambition was already shaping the destiny of the siege. The crusade was born of faith, but men like Bohemond reminded all that ambition was just as despair threatened to crush the Crusaders. New danger approached. Word came that Ridwan of Aleppo, a powerful Muslim prince, was marching with an army to relieve Antioch. From the walls, Yagysian's men shouted in triumph. The besiegers would soon be crushed between city and field. Panic rippled through the Crusader camp. They were starving, weakened, and divided. To face a fresh army seemed madness. Yet the leaders had no choice. Battle was upon them. Bohemond urged boldness, declaring they must meet the enemy head-on before he reached the city. Raymond, Godfrey, and Tancred agreed. On a cold morning, the Crusaders armed themselves. Priests blessed the soldiers, relics were raised high, and the cry of Deus Vult thundered across the valley. The knights mounted their half-starved horses, foot soldiers grasped spears, and the gates of the Crusader camp swung open. On the plain outside Antioch, two worlds collided. The disciplined charges of Frankish knights smashed into Ridwan's cavalry, their lances splintering with thunderous force. Tancred led a daring flank attack, cutting through enemy lines. Despite hunger and exhaustion, the Crusaders fought with desperate fury, and against all odds, they triumphed. Ridwan's army broke and fled. The first relief attempt had failed, and the Crusaders, though battered and bloodied, proved they would not yield. The clash with Ridwan of Aleppo left the plains outside Antioch soaked in blood. Against all odds, the half-starved Crusaders had triumphed. Their cavalry charges, though mounted on emaciated horses, had shattered the relief army. When Ridwan fled, the defenders of Antioch stood silent upon their walls, their faith in salvation shaken. For the Crusaders, victory brought both relief and grim resolve. They scoured the battlefield for weapons, armor, and food from the fallen. Corses were stripped, horses reclaimed, and prisoners taken. The camp erupted in thanksgiving. Priests leading chants of Tefadiyam, while survivors staggered from exhaustion. Yet the cost was heavy. Hundreds of Crusaders lay dead, their bodies buried in shallow graves. Many knights mourned fallen comrades. But Bohemond, ever the opportunist, proclaimed the battle a sign of divine favor and a warning that Antioch itself would soon fall. In the city, Yagysian ordered stricter measures. His garrison doubled the watch. His son Shams ad-Dawla patrolled tirelessly, and spies was sent to learn more of the enemy. He knew that though the first relief had failed, more armies would come. The fields had been won, but the siege dragged on. Hunger returned, and the shadow of Antioch loomed as impenetrable as ever. After Ridwan's defeat, the Crusaders pressed their grip around Antioch. They seized nearby fortresses, built watchtowers, and cut what supply routes they could. The siege grew ever tighter, though never complete. Inside the city, panic grew as food prices soared. Bread became rarer than gold, and even the wealthy felt hunger's bite. Yagysian ordered harsh rations, punishing hoarders with death. Still, Antioch held firm. Outside, the Crusaders' plight was no better. They were too few to surround the vast city fully, and Turkish foragers still slipped supplies through. Winter rains turned the camps into swamps of mud and filth. Disease stalked the tents, carrying away the weak. Yet the leaders pressed on. Bohemond directed construction of fortified positions, while Raymond's proven souls manned the siege lines with grim determination. Tancred launched small raids, harassing the countryside to deny Antioch relief. Hope flickered when a small Genoese fleet arrived at St. Simeon's port, bringing timber, food, and craftsmen. With their help, the Crusaders built siege engines, though few dared hope they could breach Antioch's titanic walls. The siege had become a battle of endurance, with both besiegers and besieged locked in a slow death struggle. Neither side could break free, yet in the stalemate, salvation came from the shadows. Among Antioch's garrison was Firouz, an Armenian guard embittered by mistreatment under Yagysian. His discontent did not go away. Bohemond's agents, always alert for cracks, reached out to him with promises of gold, freedom, and protection. Firouz hesitated. Betraying Antioch meant not only treason but eternal shame. Yet the cruelty he endured hardened his resolve. Secret meetings were held in the dead of night. Words were whispered through cracks in the walls. Signals exchanged with hidden torches. When Bohemond learned of Firouz's willingness, he saw his chance. He pressed his fellow leaders to grant him command of the siege if Antioch fell. Raymond balked, suspecting ambition, but Bohemond swore he alone could deliver the city. Desperate, the council agreed. Firouz revealed a weakness in the wall, an unguarded tower where he commanded the watch. There, under cover of darkness, he would admit the Crusaders. The plot was dangerous, fragile, and uncertain. But after months of starvation, the Crusaders saw hope glimmering in treachery's light. Antioch would not fall to stone or sword, but to betrayal in the night. In the dark of June dwindling Joshaban, the fate of Antioch turned on betrayal. Firouz, true to his word, opened a hidden passage into the city. Bohemond's chosen men crept forward, their armor muffled, their hearts pounding. Ladders were raised against the tower, and in silence, knights climbed into the night. The defenders slept, unaware. One by one, Crusaders entered the walls, seizing the tower. Soon, shouts erupted as the alarm spread. Torches flared, horns blared, and chaos exploded within Antioch. Gates were thrown open, and the Crusader host poured in like a flood. Bohemond rode at the forefront, his banner unfurling against the dawn. Tancred led his men through narrow alleys, cutting down defenders. Godfrey's knights stormed the streets, while Raymond's provincials hacked their way toward the citadel. Yagysian, caught unprepared, fled the city with a handful of guards. Abandoned, Antioch collapsed into panic. By sunrise, the impregnable fortress had fallen, not by strength, but by treachery. The Crusaders rejoiced, though their joy was stained with blood. Antioch was theirs. For the moment, and the night of Antioch's fall was a storm of steel and fire. Once the gates opened, the Crusaders surged inside with savage fury. The narrow streets became rivers of blood. Defenders fought desperately, but shock and betrayal shattered their ranks. Bohemond directed the assault with ruthless precision, securing strongpoints before dawn. Tancred's sword flashed as he carved through alleys, his men torching houses to flush out resistance. Godfrey's knights smashed into the heart of the city, driving panicked defenders toward the citadel. The chaos was total. Women and children screamed as soldiers flooded the streets. The clash of steel, the cries of the dying, and the roar of flames consumed the city. Antioch, once impregnable, became a slaughterhouse. At the citadel, Yagi Silian's son Shams ad-Dawla rallied the last defenders, but his father had abandoned him. Surrounded and outnumbered, he fought valiantly before retreating into the fortress above the city. By dawn, Antioch's lower city lay in Crusader hands. Exhausted soldiers dropped to their knees, thanking God for the miracle. Bohemond declared victory, though the citadel still held out. The Siege of Antioch was over. A new siege, of the Crusaders themselves, was about to begin. By dawn of June 3rd, Kerbogha, Antioch had fallen. What months of starvation and futile assaults could not achieve. Betrayal and night raids had delivered. Firouz's treachery had opened the gates, and now the Crusaders controlled the streets of the mighty city. Bohemond planted his banner proudly on the captured towers, declaring victory. The exhausted soldiers rejoiced, their voices rising in hymns of thanksgiving. For the common Crusader, it felt like a miracle. Many fell to their knees in tears, kissing the very stones of the city they had bled and starved to conquer. But victory was incomplete. Above them, on the high citadel of Mount Silpius, Shams ad-Dawla and the garrison still held strong. They rained arrows and stones upon the Crusaders below, turning the streets into killing grounds. The city was theirs in name only, half free and half still enslaved. Amidst the chaos, Yagi Siyan, the once proud governor, fled with a handful of retainers. His escape was short-lived. In the countryside, betrayed by his own servants, his head was cut off and brought back to the Crusader camp. For the victors, it was both triumph and warning. Antioch had been taken, but blood still had to be spilled before it was truly theirs. With Antioch breached, the Crusaders unleashed fury. Months of suffering erupted in vengeance. The streets ran with blood as soldiers slaughtered defenders and civilians alike. Turkish soldiers were cut down in alleys, and those who resisted were mercilessly slain. The Crusaders looted homes, torched granaries, and stripped the city of treasures. Bohemond, eager to secure his claim, ordered key gates and towers held, ensuring his control of the city. Tancred, young and fiery, drove his men into the Muslim quarters, sparing none who resisted. Godfrey, though devout, could not stem the violence, and Raymond's Provençals were equally consumed by rage. For the citizens of Antioch, there was no escape. Mothers wept over slain children, priests were cut down in mosques, and houses were reduced to ash. To the Crusaders, this was not cruelty but divine justice, proof that God had delivered victory. Priests marched among the chaos, raising relics and chanting, sanctifying the slaughter. By nightfall, the once great city lay in ruins, its streets littered with bodies. For the Crusaders, it was triumph mingled with horror. Antioch was theirs, but at the cost of mercy. After days of battle and massacre, the Crusaders allowed themselves a rare taste of joy. Antioch, once thought unconquerable, was now theirs. Exhausted soldiers feasted on seized stores of food, their hunger quenched for the first time in months. Wine flowed freely, hymns echoed in ruined churches, and the camp resounded with jubilation. Bohemond, triumphant, held lavish councils, declaring the city proof of divine favor. Yet he also maneuvered politically. pressing his claim to rule Antioch. Raymond resisted fiercely, arguing it must be given back to Byzantium, as sworn to Emperor Alexios. The lords bickered, but for the common soldier none of that mattered. At last, they ate, drank, and slept in safety. Within the walls, churches were reconsecrated, and priests proclaimed a miracle. Pilgrims kissed relics, thanking God for survival. For a brief moment, faith seemed vindicated, and Jerusalem felt within reach. But beneath the joy lurked unease. From the citadel, Shams ad-Dawla and his garrison still held out. Rumors spread of an even greater Muslim army advancing under Kerbogha of Mosul. The Crusaders celebrated, but shadows gathered once more. The joy of victory was real, but fleeting. As the Crusaders rejoiced, grim news arrived. Kerbogha of Mosul, one of the most powerful warlords of the region, was marching with a vast coalition army to crush them. Unlike Ridwan's defeated host, Kerbogha commanded tens of thousands, drawn from Mosul, Damascus, and beyond. His arrival meant doom if the Crusaders could not hold Antioch. Panic swept the ranks. They had barely taken the city and were still starving, exhausted, and divided. Now they faced annihilation. Bohemond urged preparation, strengthening defenses, and consolidating supplies. Raymond, sick and weakened, insisted they must rely on God's aid. Godfrey and Tancred tried to hold the fragile unity of the army. Together, from the citadel, Shams ad-Dawla launched renewed assaults, heartened by news of Kerbogha's approach. The Crusaders fought desperate skirmishes within the very walls of the city. Morale plummeted. Some spoke of abandoning Antioch and fleeing to the coast. Others, driven by fear, fell into fervent prayer, believing only divine intervention could save them. The Crusaders had taken Antioch, but now they were the ones besieged. In late June, Joshabat, Kerbogha's army arrived, encircling Antioch with overwhelming force. What had been a triumphant capture turned into a nightmare. The Crusaders, once besiegers, were now besieged. From every side, enemy tents stretched to the horizon, their campfires glowing like stars of doom. Kerbogha's coalition army was immense. Turks, Arabs, and Persians united for the first time. Under his command, he settled in for the kill, confident that starvation would finish the job. The sword need not. Inside Antioch, despair deepened. Food vanished within days. Men gnawed on hides and weeds, while the sick perished in droves. Priests preached endurance, but some whispered of desertion. Stephen of Blois, who had earlier fled, spread news that the Crusaders were doomed, dissuading Byzantine aid. Bohemond, refusing surrender, demanded that the lords place him in command of the defense. Some resisted, but necessity forced their hands. With iron discipline, he organized patrols, rationed food, and struck back at citadel assaults. Tancred launched desperate raids, bringing in scant supplies. Kerbogha tightened the noose, cutting off all hope. The Crusaders stood at the edge of annihilation. Only faith, and a miracle yet unseen, could save them. Inside Antioch, the jubilation of victory evaporated, with Kerbogha's vast host outside. And the citadel still in enemy hands, the Crusaders found themselves trapped in the very city they had bled to conquer. Starvation returned with a vengeance, sharper than before. The warehouses that had fed them after the city's fall were soon emptied. Bread disappeared, then meat, then even roots and weeds. Men boiled grass for broth, others stripped leather from saddles, softening it in water to chew. Horses that had survived the first famine were butchered, their bones crushed for marrow. Disease spread like wildfire. Dysentery, fever, and plague consumed the weak. The stench of unburied corpses choked the air. Thousands perished in silence, their deaths marked only by crude wooden crosses. Desertions returned as well, Some knights crept from the walls at night, scaling ropes to flee. Others opened gates in secret, slipping into the countryside. Bohemond ordered deserters hunted down and executed, making grim examples to stiffen the survivors' resolve. In this despair, some prayed with greater fervor than ever, believing only a miracle could save them. The crusade, once filled with glory, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Held together by faith and steel alone, in the darkness of despair, whispers of divine intervention began to spread. Among the starving soldiers was a humble Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew, a man known more for his fervent faith than for martial skill. He claimed to have seen a vision. Saint Andrew appeared to him, pleading that the Crusaders would be delivered if they remained steadfast. At first, many scoffed, dismissing him as delirious from hunger. But as Peter repeated his visions, others began to believe. He described angels standing upon the walls, protecting the city. He spoke of relics hidden beneath Antioch that would ensure their victory. The priests, desperate to inspire morale, encouraged his testimony. Raymond of Toulouse, eager to strengthen his influence, embraced Peter's visions as divine truth. Bohemond, skeptical but practical, allowed the visions to spread. If faith gave starving men strength, it was a weapon as real as any sword. Soon, processions filled the streets. Soldiers carried relics, priests sang hymns, and men swore renewed oaths. Hope, fragile as glass, returned. Whether Peter's visions were madness or miracle, they gave the Crusaders something Kerbogha could not starve out: belief. The most dramatic of Peter Bartholomew's visions came in June. He proclaimed that beneath the floor of the church of St. Peter in Antioch lay the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side on the cross. With this relic, he swore, God would grant the Crusaders victory. Excitement swept the camp. Priests and soldiers rushed to the church, where Peter directed them to dig beneath the altar. Hours passed, sweat dripping, hands blistering, until at last, emerging from the earth, was an iron spearhead. To many it was a miracle. Priests raised the relic high, and the soldiers erupted in cries of joy. They kissed the spear, tears streaming down gaunt faces, convinced they now bore God's weapon. Raymond embraced the discovery as proof of divine favor. Bohemond, suspicious of trickery, held his doubts, but did not oppose the fervor. To question the lance was to question hope itself, and hope was now more valuable than food. Word spread like fire. The Crusaders held the very lance that had touched Christ. Even as starvation worsened, belief surged. The Holy Lance became a rallying point, transforming despair into determination. The discovery of the Holy Lance divided the Crusaders. To many, it was proof of God's favor, the miracle they had prayed for. But others whispered doubts. Could a rusty spearhead truly be the weapon that pierced Christ's side? Or was Peter Bartholomew a liar, planting the relic to deceive the starving army? The question split leaders and soldiers alike. Raymond of Toulouse embraced the lance wholeheartedly, parading it through the streets, using it to bind his followers tighter. Bohemond, ever calculating, kept silent, unwilling to undermine morale, yet unconvinced of its authenticity. Godfrey of Bouillon hesitated, his faith battling his reason. Meanwhile, priests declared that doubters were tools of the devil. Soldiers who once despaired now walked with pride, believing they carried heaven's weapon. Yet in quiet corners, murmurs of fraud persisted. Peter himself grew bolder, insisting he would undergo trial by fire if necessary to prove the lance's holiness. For now, his vision stood unchallenged. Faith and doubt clashed like swords. But one truth remained: whether miracle or fraud, the Holy Lance gave the Crusaders the strength to fight. Outside Antioch, Kerbogha of Mosul tightened his noose. His army, vast and diverse, spread across the plains like a sea of steel. Siege engines were constructed, towers rolled toward the walls, and arrows rained day and night. The Crusaders, though weakened, held firm. Bohemond directed defenses with ruthless efficiency, ordering men to patch walls and dig trenches. Tancred led skirmishes at the gates, striking swiftly before vanishing back inside. Priests walked the walls with relics, including the Holy Lance, lifting morale with chants. Inside, starvation worsened. Some whispered of surrender, but others clung to faith more fiercely than ever. Processions filled the streets, relics lifted high, prayers echoing louder than the thunder of siege engines. Kerbogha, confident, bided his time. He knew hunger was the sharpest weapon. Yet cracks formed in his coalition. Rival emirs distrusted his leadership, some already plotting to abandon him. The siege became a battle not only of arms, but of spirit. Antioch, scarred and broken, became a crucible where faith, ambition, and desperation collided. Both sides waited for the final storm, the clash that would decide the fate of the crusade. Kerbogha's camp stretched across the plains like a sea of iron. His army was vast. Turks, Persians, Arabs, and Kurdish warriors gathered from across the east. Yet beneath the banners of unity, cracks spread. Each emir had his own ambitions, his own jealousies, and few trusted Kerbogha. Whispers moved from tent to tent. Some feared Kerbogha sought to seize their lands if victory came. Others resented his arrogance, claiming he treated allies as vassals. Rivalries festered, sharpened by pride. Kerbogha, though a seasoned commander, misjudged the fragile coalition. He delayed a direct assault, hoping starvation would do his work. But the delay fed doubts. Emirs murmured that he was hesitant, weak, perhaps even cursed. Inside Antioch, the Crusaders prayed for such divisions. Scouts reported arguments in the enemy camp. Bohemond seized the moment, declaring it proof. God had sown discord among the infidels. Raymond, wielding the Holy Lance, preached that divine providence was at hand. The siege tightened, but Kerbogha's grip was not as strong as it seemed. His army was vast, but his coalition brittle. It was only a matter of time before Betrayal splintered his host. By late June, starvation had nearly broken the Crusaders. Yet faith refused to die. With the Holy Lance carried at the front, they prepared to march out of Antioch and face Kerbogha's enormous host in open battle. It seemed madness. They were outnumbered, weakened, half dead from hunger. But to surrender meant certain death. Bohemond argued boldly, better to die in battle with honor than starve behind walls like rats. Was lit firing weary hearts. On the morning of June Ursurbath, Itenling Joshabad, the Crusaders assembled in ranks. Priests blessed them, relics were raised, and the cry of Deus Vult thundered across the broken city. Emaciated soldiers donned what armor they had, their banners patched and torn, but their spirits aflame. They marched through Antioch's gates in solemn order, knights at the front, infantry behind, relics borne high. From the walls, defenders of the citadel jeered, certain the Franks were marching to their doom. But for the Crusaders, this was not despair. It was deliverance. They marched not as starving men, but as chosen warriors of God. The miracle march had begun, and destiny awaited them on the fields beyond, on the plains beyond Antioch. Two armies faced one another. Kerbogha's coalition, vast and glittering, outnumbered the Crusaders many times over. His cavalry spread across the horizon, banners snapping in the wind. Against them stood the thin, ragged ranks of the Crusaders, their armor patched, their bodies gaunt, but their faith unshaken. Bohemond organized the army into divisions, each led by a great lord, Godfrey, Raymond, Tancred, and others. At the heart of the host, priests carried relics, chanting hymns that rolled like thunder. Kerbogha unleashed his cavalry, confident the Crusaders would crumble. But the knights of Christendom met them with iron will. Godfrey's lances shattered the first charge. Raymond's Provençals held the line against repeated assaults. Tancred, reckless and brilliant, led a daring flank attack, scattering enemy horsemen into chaos. For hours the field was filled with dust, steel, and blood. The Crusaders, though outnumbered, fought with the fury of desperation. And then, the miracle. Rumors spread that saints in white armor had appeared, riding alongside the Franks, striking terror into Kerbogha's men. Whether vision or rumor, panic spread through the enemy ranks. Kerbogha's army began to crumble. The coalition that had once seemed unstoppable fractured under the weight of doubt and fear. The emirs, already suspicious of his leadership, broke ranks one by one. Some fled the field, abandoning their men. Others simply watched as their allies collapsed. Seeing the defections, the Crusaders pressed harder. Bohemond ordered a general advance. Godfrey's knights surged forward, trampling enemy lines. Raymond's men captured banners and standards. Tancred, wild with zeal, pursued fleeing cavalry, his sword flashing in relentless pursuit. Kerbogha fought to rally his men, but his cries went unheard. The vision of saints on horseback, whether real or imagined, had broken the spirit of his host. Panic turned to rout and rout to slaughter. Thousands fled, casting aside weapons and shields. By evening, the field belonged to the Crusaders. Against all odds, the starving army of Antioch had defeated a coalition, many times its size. Priests declared it a miracle. Soldiers wept in joy, and Bohemond stood triumphant, his claim to glory secured. Kerbogha rode from the battlefield in shame, his great army shattered. The siege of Antioch was over. The battlefield of Antioch was silent, but for the cries of the wounded. Corpses lay in heaps across the plains, broken lances jutting like grave markers. The Crusaders, though victorious, were too exhausted even to cheer. Many collapsed where they stood, their bodies trembling from hunger and battle. Inside the city, joy mingled with horror. Survivors embraced, thanking God for deliverance. Priests paraded the Holy Lance through the streets, declaring that heaven itself had secured the victory. Men wept openly, convinced they had witnessed a miracle. Yet the cost was immense. Thousands of Crusaders had perished during the siege. Disease still stalked the city, and famine lingered despite the victory. Families mourned, burying comrades in mass graves. Antioch, once a jewel of the East, was now a scarred and broken ruin. For the leaders, triumph was tinged with rivalry. Bohemond, his ambition undisguised, declared Antioch his prize. Raymond resisted fiercely, insisting it belonged to Byzantium. Godfrey, more moderate, saw unity, but was powerless to stop the quarrels. The Crusaders had survived annihilation, but their unity was fraying. The victory at Antioch had saved the crusade, but it also planted darkened the seeds of division that would shape the road to Jerusalem. Antioch was won, but peace was not. Victory only sharpened ambition. Bohemond of Taranto, who had orchestrated the city's betrayal, claimed Antioch as his rightful prize. He argued that by his hand, the city had fallen, and that Providence had marked it for him. Raymond of Toulouse, fiery and proud, stood in defiance. He declared Antioch was not for any single man to claim, but must be restored to Emperor Alexios, as sworn at Constantinople. Their arguments echoed through the ruined city. Godfrey of Bouillon, ever moderate, tried to mediate, but divisions ran deep. Tancred sided with Bohemond, eager to see his Norman kin gain a foothold in the east. Many Provençals backed Raymond, bound by loyalty and faith. The crusade united by blood and faith, now teetered on the brink of civil strife. Antioch had been a miracle, but in its shadow, ambition poisoned unity. In the weeks after the victory, Bohemond pressed his claim with iron will. He seized key towers, stationed Norman garrisons, and summoned allies to his banner. His voice was clear: Antioch was his. Raymond resisted, even threatening to march away, but his illness weakened him. Many lords, weary of famine and conflict, grudgingly accepted Bohemond's control. Tancred proclaimed him Prince of Antioch, though no such title yet existed. Bohemond walked the streets like a ruler already crowned. He distributed spoils to his men, secured trade routes, and began fortifying Antioch as a Norman stronghold. Yet shadows lingered. The Byzantines had been promised this city, and the emperor would not forget the betrayal. Ambition had triumphed, but unity suffered. Antioch was now Norman in all but name, and the crusade fractured further under the weight of pride. Far away in Constantinople, news reached Emperor Alexios Komnenos, but not of victory. Fleeing deserters, including Stephen of Blois, carried tales of doom, claiming the Crusaders were destroyed. Believing the cause lost, Alexios turned back his relief army. When word of this reached Antioch, fury erupted. The Crusaders felt betrayed, abandoned in their darkest hour. Bohemond seized the moment, declaring Alexios had broken faith first, freeing them from their oaths. To many knights, his words rang true. Raymond argued that the emperor had been misled, not treacherous. But the voices of outrage drowned him out. Antioch, once promised to Byzantium, would never return to imperial hands. The bond between Crusader and Byzantine was shattered. The crusade that had begun in the name of alliance now marched forward in the spirit of independence. Even defiance, the victory at Antioch had saved the crusade, but it also divided it. Bohemond entrenched himself as master of the city, while Raymond withdrew in protest. Tensions spread through the ranks: Normans against Provençals, ambition against faith. Some lords argued for pressing on to Jerusalem at once. Others insisted on resting, rebuilding strength, and securing Antioch. The soldiers, weary and starving still, grumbled at endless delays. Godfrey sought to keep unity, reminding them of their sacred vow. Priests preached against discord, warning that division would bring God's wrath. Yet pride and politics proved stronger than sermons. The road to Jerusalem lay open, but Antioch had sown seeds of rivalry that would not die. The crusade, though victorious, was no longer one host. It was a coalition strained to breaking. By January, Itzenling Jorsajol. After months of delay, the Crusaders turned their eyes southward. Jerusalem still waited. Despite quarrels, starvation, and disease, the army reformed, driven by the vow that had brought them east. The march began slowly. Columns of knights, priests, and peasants wound through the Syrian countryside. Villages and towns fell before them, some surrendering, others resisting. Each mile was marked by hardship, yet also by renewed purpose. Bohemond remained in Antioch, cementing his Norman principality. Raymond, still defiant, led a separate force, determined to claim his own glory. Godfrey, Bouillon, and Tancred pressed on with steady determination. The Crusaders marched with relics held high, their tattered banners fluttering in desert winds. Starvation and ambition had nearly broken them, but Jerusalem was now within reach. Antioch was behind them. The holy city lay ahead. The Siege of Antioch left scars that would never heal. It had been a crucible of faith and fire, where thousands perished and miracles were proclaimed. It revealed the heights of human courage and the depths of cruelty. For the Crusaders, Antioch was proof that God's hand guided them. The visions, the holy lance, and the impossible victory over Kerbogha became legends told in every campfire tale. Yet for others, Antioch revealed ambition and betrayal, Bohemon's treachery, Stephen's desertion, Alexios's retreat. Antioch also reshaped the map. From its ashes, Bohemond forged a Norman principality that would stand for centuries as a Crusader state. It became both a gateway to Jerusalem and a fortress of division. Above all, Antioch showed that the crusade was no longer just a pilgrimage, it was conquest. The legacy of its siege would echo across Christendom, inspiring both awe and dread. The story of Antioch did not end with its walls, nor with its princes. It lived on in memory, an echo of faith and fire that resounded across centuries. For the Crusaders, it was a turning point. They had faced despair, famine, betrayal, and overwhelming odds, yet they emerged victorious. To many, it was nothing less than a miracle, proof that God had chosen them as his warriors. But Antioch was also a warning. It revealed the ambition of men, the price of disunity, and the horrors wrought in the name of faith. Thousands of innocents perished, cities burned, and alliances shattered. Yet through fire and blood, the Crusaders pressed on. The fall of Antioch paved the road to Jerusalem, where the holy city itself awaited. Their journey was not yet done, but the memory of Antioch would march with them. And so, as the sun set over its scarred walls, Antioch stood as a monument to both faith and ambition, human endurance and human fall. Its echo would never fade, carried by every soldier who had survived its siege, and by every tale told thereafter. And so, dear friends, our journey through the Siege of Antioch comes to an end. We have walked the same muddy roads as starving soldiers, stood beneath the shadow of walls thought unconquerable, and felt the clash of faith and ambition in the hearts of princes. We have seen how betrayal and miracle, steel and prayer, shaped the fate of a city, and with it, the destiny of the First Crusade. Antioch was more than a battlefield. It was a crucible where faith was tested, where unity broke and rivalries rose, and where ordinary men and women endured trials beyond imagination. From its ashes, heroes and villains alike emerged, carrying forward both scars and triumphs. As we leave Antioch behind, let us remember that history is not only written in victories, but also in suffering, sacrifice, and the choices of flawed but determined souls. Thank you for walking with me through this tale of endurance, ambition, and unshakable belief. May the lessons of Antioch echo in your hearts, long after the last torchlight fades from its ancient walls. This was the story of faith and fire. This was the Siege of Antioch,